Homage to the Triple Gem. So, welcome to our bi-weekly Dhamma discussion. And I was asked a question, I think about 2 weeks ago now, about essentially the state of an arahant after death. So, the question, just paraphrasing, was basically that if samsara is a process, is nibanna the only process outside of samsara? Then she said something like, I'm trying to figure out whether nibanna is a permanent state of annihilation or a permanent state of peaceful existence. So essentially, the question is about the state of an arahant after death. How should one conceive of it? How should one describe it? So one of the first things that have to address when talking about the state of an arahant after death is that the Buddha said that it's a question that should be put aside. And to describe why he said it should be put aside, we have to jump into his teachings on anatta, or not self, a little bit. So essentially there's two camps, two ways of looking at the Buddha's teachings on not self. One of the camps, the traditional one, is that the Buddha's teachings on not self were a teaching of no self, that there's no agency, no agent behind experience, and that all events are essentially a series of causes and conditions. And so nibbana in that case is essentially a kind of annihilation, that one is eliminated at nibbana, kind of like a spiritual suicide almost, and so that's it. So in that case you could say nibbana is like a permanent state of annihilation, a permanent nothingness, but you couldn't call it a state. It's just, that's it. There was nothing. There's nothing there, and when you achieve nibbana, that's it. It's just kind of an annihilation. So there's some serious problems with the traditional position that the Buddha's teachings on anatta are meant to be a teaching on no self. One of them is that the Buddha criticizes asking questions like, what am I? Who am I? Where did this being come from? Where did it go? And he says, as a result of asking those questions, a person comes to different conclusions. One is, I have a self. Another is, I have no self. Another is like, with the self, I perceive what is not self, or the self is this knower, this kind of awareness that's here and now. Now, the problem with those positions, both I have a self and I have no self, so right there, the Buddha's listing this position, I have no self, as a wrong view, essentially. And that's a big problem with that traditional position. The problem with it is that these positions are what the Buddha calls craving standpoints. So the Buddha criticizes both annihilationism and eternalism. And one of the reasons for this is these things are craving standpoints. They're a view that one takes based on craving, and they're essentially actually a process by which one does create an identity, does create a sense of becoming. So one creates an identity, in this case, that one is going to be annihilated, and it's based on craving, that one wants to be smashed out of existence or something some of the time. But in any event, there's many different ways that one could desire a kind of an annihilationist perspective, or reach that perspective. The point of it is, in that adopting this perspective, it's a standpoint for craving, and that's a standpoint for rebirth. So the Buddha's teachings on self and not self are a teaching about a process. They're a teaching about an action. They're a teaching about a type of kamma. There's something that a person does. So the Buddha describes the process of creating a self as a hankara mamankara, which means I making and my making. So for there to be a self, the Buddha says there has to be the possessions of a self. So what that means is that a self has to have some particular characteristics that a person gives to it. So if a person conceives of something that they don't want, that they don't like, or conceives of how they'll be in the future, this is essentially a way of conceiving what their self will be. And the way that the Buddha describes this is maybe most clearly expressed. It can be clearly expressed in different places. One of the most clear expressions is in the teaching on dependent co-arising, or paticca samuppada. So there you have somebody getting contacted by something, like anything in the world. Somebody says hello, somebody says goodbye, somebody says great job, somebody says bad job, somebody smiles, somebody frowns, one falls and trips and breaks one's leg, whatever it might be. There's a kind of contact, an external contact with an internal sense faculty. And there's these kind of contacts, then you have a feeling as a result of that. Either it's a happy feeling, pleasant, an unpleasant feeling, or a neutral feeling. And as a result of these feelings, one develops craving, and kind of one wants the feeling to stay, one wants it to go away, and kind of in cases of neutral feelings, maybe one starts, getting distracted and thinking about things that are not there in the present moment because there's just nothing really all that exciting to look at. In any event, after this feeling, you have craving, kind of this desire. After craving, you have clinging. You cling to whatever it is you want, or whatever it is that you don't. You try to cling to whatever it is that you want, or to push away whatever it is that you don't want, which is essentially another type of clinging. You're clinging to a state that you don't have. You don't want this particular state. You want another one. As a result of this clinging, you get becoming. So when you contact these things, you cling to them, that's essentially making a possession of the self. So when you create a possession for a self, a characteristic for the self, then you get this becoming where you create a sense of yourself. I'm the person who's like this. I'm a person who's not like this. In the future, I'll be like this. In the future, I won't be like this. And as a result of these kind of conceptions, you get born. There's kind of a literal sense. You get reborn when you die in a particular realm. There's even places you can get reborn where you have no perceptions at all. If a person really desires annihilation and thinks nibbana is annihilation, then there's ways that you can meditate, there's ways that you can practice in which you get this total blanking out. And if you latch onto that state, you get reborn in this realm of like perceptionless beings where there's just no perception for a while, and that karma wears off and you come back and get reborn as something else. So this process, this what the Buddha describes as a self, is a process that's based on craving. And conceiving that there is no self, conceiving I have a self, both of these things are standpoints for craving. So this is a problem because whenever one craves for something, whatever identity one creates around something, it eventually falls away and that causes one to suffer. It's kind of Buddhism 101. So the mistake that's often made is to take the Buddha's teachings on not self and put them over top of all the other teachings. Like, he's giving this ontological truth. The teachings on not self go underneath the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths are called the elephant's footprint. All the rest of his teachings fit into them. So what this means is that the Buddha's teachings on not self are to be used as a means to end suffering. They're not an ontological truth necessarily, like an ontological position. There is, no self, there's nothing behind experience. So I got into this back and forth with a senior monk, a few vasas senior to me. It was kind of respectful and friendly back and forth around the Buddhist positions on self or not self. And essentially he took the traditional commentarial position. And with that position, he basically had developed this really complex phenomenology about the way that the world, we say complex, but he developed a lot of theories about the way that the world interacts without there being any agency. So he couldn't make any choices, because if there's no self, there's no choice. You can't make any choices. So I was cross-questioning him, how is this different from determinism? The Buddha has strongly criticized determinism, saying that there was a teacher of determinism in his time named Macaulay Gosala, and he called him the worst among ascetics and compared him to a hair shirt. A hair shirt is hot in the hot weather, cold in the cold weather, ugly, foul-smelling, and uncomfortable. It's kind of a pretty intense comparison. And he said in the same way, this hollow man Macaulay, his doctrines are the worst among ascetics, because he teaches a doctrine of fatalism, whereas the Buddhas of the past have taught a doctrine of kamma, a doctrine of effort, a doctrine of actions, and at present, our Buddha, teaches a doctrine of action, a doctrine of kamma, a doctrine of effort. And he contradicts the Buddhas. So if there's this fatalism, if all there are causes and conditions, and there's no randomness in the system, there's no ability of an agent, or there's no ability to choose between two competing alternatives, then actually teachings on effort, teachings on intention actually don't really make much sense. Those words lose a lot of their meaning. And the Buddha criticized this position of fatalism because it's It leads a person essentially to apathy. It can have a lot of negative consequences. It can also lead people to arrogance. You can think, well, I'm fated to be this really great person, and they're fated to be, a really bad person. Not recognizing that these things come from intentions, from actions that one has taken and others have taken, both in the present and in the past, and they won't last. So the Buddha criticizes this doctrine of determinism so strongly, and it's indistinguishable from the position that I have no self. So that position, I have no self, has to be set aside. And this position, I have no self, is also meaning that nibbana is a type of annihilation. The Buddha also criticizes annihilationism. Okay, essentially, it's a craving standpoint. And so this position, this view that nibbana will be an eternal state of annihilation, is a view that has to be set aside. Now, another position that's represented by the Thai forest tradition that I was kind of defending in this back and forth is that the Buddha's teachings on not self are a strategy. And this is, Ajahn Thanissaro has done quite a lot of work on this topic. And a lot of the points that we've referenced are actually coming from his works and the research that he's done. And essentially, what we see is that the Buddha teaching in the canon anatta as a perception. He calls it anatta sanya. So you use this perception of not self to stop this process where you've got contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, to put a stop to that so that you don't cling to things and you don't suffer. Now, the Buddha describes the world in ways that don't touch strongly on external ontological truths. He describes the world essentially as the 5 clinging aggregates. There's kind of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. He describes that as the world. He also describes these things as the all. So the all is everything. And he says, repudiating the all, if somebody says, I were to repudiating the all, I will describe something else, then that would be impossible. Why is that? Because it lies beyond range. So it doesn't say that there's nothing beyond the all, just as it lies beyond range. There's a number of other suttas in which the people question, what is with the remainderless fading and ceasing away of remainderless fading and ceasing of craving. Is there something? Is there nothing? Is there both something and nothing? And the answer is essentially you're proliferating the unproliferated. You're objectifying the unobjectified. So in other words, you've gone too far. You're coming up with concepts about a thing that is actually beyond concepts. So the Buddha describes the all as basically everything that we might experience. And he says beings are enveloped in ignorance like an egg. So in other words, the totality of our experience, we don't experience anything outside of the all. I shouldn't say everything we might experience. Everything we might experience in samsara. And just going through samsara and doing whatever we're doing, meditating, whatever, living a normal life, that all falls within the all. That is all seen, sensed, cognized through the 5 aggregates. That is based on clinging and craving. And that is based on this creation of a sense of self, essentially. One's creating this self and being born because of it. So the Buddha does describe that there is something outside of the all. He calls this thing that's outside of the all in one sutta, anidasana vijnana, or consciousness without surface. So normally for consciousness to come into being, it has to reflect off of something. It's got to have an external object. You get your eye, you've got a form, you get eye consciousness arising because of that. You've got an ear, you've got a sound. You get consciousness at the ear, this awareness. And, going through all of the senses, including the mind, that's everything. That's the world for a person. That's the all for a person. They don't experience things outside of that within samsara. So this anidasana vijnana, he says it's not known through the earthness of earth, the fieriness of fire, the wateriness of water, the airiness of air, the allness of the all. It's kind of something to be directly known, directly experienced. But essentially you can't conceive it, because whatever conceptions, whatever experiences a person has had in their life, just going through samsara, it's not possible to conceive of it in the same way as those experiences. It has to be known directly without any external medium. So when the process of becoming is brought to an end permanently, as there is for an arahant, and kind of you keep practicing in such a way that you eliminate your craving in increasingly subtle ways and then in permanent ways for particular fetters. At the end, eliminating craving for everything. At that point, you can't say that you're creating a self anymore. The craving, the clinging, the becoming has stopped, and as a result, the birth and the future death will stop. So that is the end of the creation of a self. So the Buddha has this phrase, sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe dhamma anattati. So sometimes I might have gotten the anicca and dukkha confused, but the main point is that what he's saying is that all conditioned things are impermanent, all conditioned things are suffering, but all dhammas, all phenomenon, are not self. So what that means is that both anything within samsara, that's dhammas, also nibbana is described as a dhamma. Both of those things are not self. So in a sense you could say that there's no self because nibbana is also not a self. But it doesn't mean that nibbana is annihilation. It means that this process of creating a self has stopped. And what lies beyond that process is beyond proliferation, it's beyond objectification, it's beyond conjecture. And any type of thinking, like imagining, oh, nibbana is this realm, kind of where I'm permanently annihilated. Okay, that is a craving standpoint. From that, you're creating a sense of self, and that will lead to further rebirth. Having this thought, well, nibbana is this permanent realm where I'm permanently peaceful. I'm just kind of like imagining myself as permanently peaceful. That imagining can be a craving standpoint. It's kind of an eternalist view, when taking something within samsara and believing that that is permanent, that leads one on to further rebirth. So the Buddha has said that he basically teaches suffering and the ending of suffering. His teaching is teleological. It's aimed at an end. It's not aimed at describing ontological truths about the world. And when people from the West sometimes come to Buddhism, Western philosophy is aimed at describing like what's really real. And kind of another thing that I read in, I think, an article or so about gentleness was kind of it's based on the I. It's kind of is what's outside really real? And so thinking about this, is what's outside really real or is it not really real? When one comes to Buddhism, sometimes those are the questions that one can seek to answer. But the Buddha's aim was teleologically. It wasn't aiming at teaching what was really real outside. His teachings were aimed at leading people to the ending of suffering. So, because thinking about, do I have a self? Do I have no self? Leads one to cling to something within samsara. This is a question that should be put aside. And it can't really be answered. What is it like what's the state of an arahant after death? Because it's beyond proliferation. Any attempt to answer it in terms of conceiving it as this state, conceiving it as that state, is something that can lead to further rebirth. So the Buddha said this question, does an arahant exist after death? Tathagata exist after death? Not exist? Both? Neither? Should be put aside. However, there are some things that he did say about nibbana. We already discussed, he described what's beyond the all as anidasana vijnana, a type of consciousness, consciousness without surface. He's called it permanence, he's called it the highest happiness, or happiness, he's called it the harbor, shelter, he's called it nibbana, which is kind of snuff it like putting out or something as a really rough translation. So there's similes that the Buddha gives in the canon, a couple of them at least, where he kind of, through the simile, you can get a sense of nibbana as something very positive, something very peaceful, something very happy, but something that's beyond conception. So one of them is the simile of a beam of light. So the Buddha asks monks one time, if there was a house, I think with an eastern window, if the beam of light came through the window, where would it land? And the monks say on the wall. If there was no wall, where would it land? It would land on the floor. I'm just paraphrasing here. If there's no floor, no ground, where would it land? It would land on the water. In those days, they thought that the earth was supported by the water. If there was no water, where would it land? It wouldn't land. So, in the same way, the Buddha describes it when a monk has given up craving. They've given up this creation of a self-identity, then consciousness doesn't land on the 5 aggregate space, doesn't land on the 6 sense space, it doesn't land on the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind. One of the interesting things that he says in that sutta is that consciousness doesn't land on consciousness. So when it doesn't land, it's not manifest. It's kind of essentially the ending of suffering. It's almost something inconceivable. I can't really conceive of that, because everything within our experience comes under this interaction between an internal and an external sense base. But because it's inconceivable doesn't mean that it's eliminated, that consciousness is, or that a person, or whatever you might say, that it's an annihilation. What it means is that there's just nothing you can say about it. Like a beam of light, if it doesn't reflect off of anything, it doesn't eliminate the light. It's just you can't perceive it. It hasn't come into being anywhere. It hasn't reflected off of anything. So in that sense, it's not part of what would be possible for a person to experience. So the Buddha has this teaching that there is the unborn, the unformed, the uncreated, the unoriginated. If there wasn't the unborn, the unformed, the uncreated, the unoriginated, there would be no escape from the born, the formed, the created, the originated. But because there is the unborn, etc., there is an escape. So when a person has severed craving, when they stop the process of I-making and my-making, when they've done these things, and they can have a direct experience of something beyond the all. It's kind of anidasana vijnana, without surface. There's nothing to reflect off of. Consciousness always needs something to reflect off of. This is a state that's described as peaceful. This is a state that's described as happiness. It's a state that's described as permanence. And although it's something difficult to conceive, it can be experienced. And it is the end of suffering.